I did reviews of the original Hitcher as well as the House on Sorority Row. I looked at Prom Night, When a Stranger Calls, because I had this thing to where I had seen a lot of these remakes for like these old school horror flicks. A lot of them were slashers, and I never went back and watched the original film because in most cases, either the original got like rave reviews and the remakes didn't get too good of words, or it'd be vice versa. I was like, I would prefer to watch like the newer stuff. So like I had always seen the new version of The Hitcher with Sean Bean, but like I hadn't watched the original, and so like when the remake came out, I wouldn't watch the original. When Sorority Row came out, I watched Sorority Row, like the remake, but I never watched the original until like really recently. So it's just kind of interesting to look at like all of these films in such a different light these days, because now that I'm trying to catch up on all these films I just should have watched for decades at this point here, I'm getting to see a lot of really, really true classics. Now I say that as I come around to look at a different remake here of The Hitcher, because I'm not talking about the original, but it's just interesting to me. So, as I said, a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to review the original film, The Hitcher, starring C. Thomas Howell and Rutger Hauer. And I talked about how I really did enjoy the film, and I really did. But one of the bigger issues with that story is the fact that it's kind of on the dull side. And I don't know if there's a way to make that sound not negative, because I don't mean that negatively, because there's a lot to enjoy about The Hitcher. But at the same time, it's also just a bit boring. Like it's very much a character-driven piece. The entire film is really about this guy John Ryder, you know, the titled Hitcher, chasing down Jim Halsey and basically turning him into him. Like that's really the point of the original Hitcher film, is that John Ryder is trying to push Jim like past his breaking point to where Jim just becomes a shell of a man, very similar to how he is. Like he's in trouble with the police. He has no help. He has nowhere to turn at all. He's committing all of these criminal acts at this point, and now he's left with the literal only choice he has left, which is to kill this man. And John Ryder succeeds in that, and that he turns Jim into basically almost imitation of himself by the end of the film. And that worked very much for the original movie. But in like the early to mid 2000s, this is when the remake craze was just going like everywhere at this point. And a lot of studios were snatching up like a lot of these old slashers and horror flicks and just trying to get any remake out they could, because horror itself, it's not that it had gotten like old or like stagnant or anything like that, but we did the whole Japanese horror craze in the early 2000s as well too, which made a decent amount of money, but that can only go on for so long. So the next thing was to start doing like all of these remakes. And The Hitcher was one of these remakes that we got, and not one that I think a lot of people would have expected, because it's not like the original film is like this huge movie by any means, but it didn't change the fact that it's just a bit of an odd remake to pull out to do. And this time, it would star Sean Bean, who we all know from like GoldenEye, and of course now, didn't know him then at the point, but now from like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, playing the titled Hitcher. And then we now had a new Jim Halsey, played by Zachary Knighton from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia fame. Now, it is interesting because in the mid 2000s, everything was about ramping up the horror. So in a lot of these remakes that we got a lot more violence, a lot more victims, a lot more blood, a lot more gore, a lot more death. And that was the thing, because that's what audience wanted in 2000. Because again, we're coming off the wave of the Japanese horror craze coming through, and those films are known for just being like big, and they're freaky, and they're gross, and they're scary. So we had to do the same kind of thing. And it's interesting because while yes, The Hitcher is a remake, at the same time, it's an entirely different kind of film, because the original movie, in my review, I called it a slasher of sorts, and it is, because John Ryder definitely goes and, you know, kills a number of people in the original film, but the way that it's done is that it's a very slow and drawn out kind of film. Like it's actually very similar in a way to the original When a Stranger Calls, because if you remember my review for that, I mentioned how like the beginning, iconic, it's scary, it's absolutely, you know, what you come to expect from a slasher film, and then when we get back to the end of the film with the victim at the beginning, and the killer again. We're right back into that same exact scenario, but the rest of the film is very much an action film or a suspense film. It's not a horror movie, and that's kind of the way that the original Hitcher was. And Michael Bay's company, Platinum Dunes, produced this remake, as they produced a lot of remakes in the 2000s. And I think that they took what would probably be a very boring film to today's audiences and absolutely updated it to fit the times. And I think that means it worked out extremely well. And I know that this film doesn't have a lot of defenders to it, and there's some reasons behind it we'll get into, but I think that this movie, honestly, is actually one of the better horror remakes that we have out there. There's a big story change in this, to where the original film is about Jim Halsey transporting this car from one side of the country to the other side of the country, and he runs across this hitchhiker, and his life just becomes living hell from there on. And in this film, it's about Jim Halsey and his girlfriend Grace, played by Sophia Bush, who are basically, they're going to meet Grace's family and friends because they've been dating for a while, and they're presumably going to get married, and now it's time for Jim to meet Grace's family. And right off the jump, that changes the entire layout of the film, because the first movie, or the original movie, really was trying to give us a cautionary lesson. At least that was part of the story, is that this is why they say don't pick up hitchhikers. You know, you're driving alone. You know, you don't have a phone or anything like that, because this is back in the 80s. What are you doing picking up somebody who you don't know anything about, who could be a murderous killer, which turns out that they were. And again, the whole point is trying to turn Jim into Ryder. And this film's not really about that, because the whole idea is that Ryder is just this deranged villain, basically. And while the end of the movie might have you think that he's trying to turn one or both of these characters into an image of him, realistically, he might say that, but I think it's simple enough that he's just hunting these two, because unfortunately they ran across him. They were unfortunate enough to end up in Ryder's crosshairs. Now, the way they're introduced as well, a bit differently, because again, like in the original film, Jim just picks up Ryder and that's it. Whereas in this film, Grace and Jim almost hit Ryder randomly on the road. Grace from the jump tells Jim that she's not comfortable, doesn't want him picking him up. They'll call for help at some point there, but they shouldn't just grab this guy who's standing out in the middle of the road. And Grace is being the voice of reason, because, you know, obviously there's got to be something to tell you that there's going to be some danger coming. And I don't want to keep comparing the two back and forth, so I'm going to try to kind of lay off going back from the original film to the remake. But Grace is the voice of reason that they shouldn't be picking this guy up. And unfortunately, not too much later there, when they end up at a gas station, they run into John Ryder, who has made it and caught up to them, basically, and is now asked for a ride to kind of take care of his business. And that's where we end up in the same scenario, to where John then begins to threaten Jim and Grace, and basically tells them that he's going to kill them unless they stop him. And this begins the cat and mouse chase that makes up the entire film, that is the Hitcher. Now, the rest of the movie, again, plays very, very differently out from the original film, and I don't want to keep making comparisons, but it's important to point out that if you're going to watch this movie, you're definitely coming in for that 2000s big slasher vibe, you know, to where, like, it's just about getting away from this killer who's racking up a body count, and that's it. And that's really what the movie is that Grace and Jim are trying to stay one step ahead of Ryder as he keeps collecting a body count. And unfortunately, in some cases, like, it does force us to push a little bit past our belief and, like, suspending what's reasonable. Because, like, when John Ryder takes out, like, an entire sheriff's office, or sheriff's department, whatever you want to call it, it's like, all right, dude, like, you're that good at this point. Only in a horror movie. Only in a horror movie. Because you're not even Jason, you're not Freddy or anything. But, of course, you can kill all of these cops. Which I knock on that to only give props later on in the film to the badass sequence that's set to 9 Inch Nails Closer. Absolutely love that sequence, to where they basically they redo one of the scenes from the original film where Jim's being chased down by the police. This time it's Jim and Grace. And while Jim and Grace are being chased down by the police, Ryder shows up to save them, also incriminating them some more by taking care of their pursuance. And it's just a great scene. I think obviously large in part to the song choice that they choose to use, but the editing and the cinematography and the camera work and all of that in that scene is just so good. Now, in terms of like, is it a scary movie? Not really. Rutger Hauer is an absolutely scary individual, and it makes sense. He did so much horror in his lifetime that like it was kind of synonymous. It made sense. Him playing a role like John Ryder, because he's a scary guy. And Sean Bean absolutely can be scary. This is before, we started getting other roles where it's like, oh man, the dude can be good and he's bright and he's charming and everything as well. And the problem is with that is that we then have to just kind of go off what we know about Sean Bean so far, and he fits the role of John Ryder, of being this like gruff, scary, deranged madman. But at the same time, though, there's something missing between the two performances there. There's not the same levity with Sean Bean's Ryder versus Rutger Hauer's Ryder. And it's interesting because Sean Bean kills more people. He absolutely has a higher body count than Rutger Hauer did in the original film, for sure. But it doesn't change the fact, though, that something just feels like it's lacking a little bit when it comes. I don't know if it's the intensity or if it's the danger or I don't know what, but something feels just slightly like it's lacking. Also, and we're going to go ahead and jump into the spoilers for this here because, again, we're past our 10-year rule at this point. It's also hard not to ignore the fact that Jim feels wasted. And I don't know. I don't know if that's a bad thing because Grace is absolutely our lead in this film, and we don't really realize that until we get to about halfway through the movie that Grace is really the lead of this film and not Jim. It's kind of like the Nightmare on Elm Street, and even more so in tune with the reboot, to where Katie Cassidy very much was the lead of that film for a good chunk of it before it's like, oh, right, you have to die because we have to get Rooney Mara as our lead of this film instead. And it's kind of the same thing that the Hitcher does. And for a good choice, because no knocks on Zachary Knighton. I don't know a lot of his work. I've enjoyed what I've seen him in, and It's Always Sunny. And there's been something else I've seen him in too, and I just can't think of it. But Sophia Bush is a great actress who definitely excels in the horror genre for sure. I've talked about Stay Alive on the show before, my enjoyment of that and how good she does in that as well too. And this is no different. Like, she does just as great of a job as Grace here in The Hitcher. And she's really the emotional weight of the movie. She has to put so much of it on her shoulders. And I feel she sells fear so well in the film. And again, that just goes to show that this was a genre that I wish she got a chance to do way more in, because she does such a great job as this leading actress and this final girl in some of the films that she's done. Now, beyond that, it's not that much of a scary film, and that's not a negative mark on it in the least bit, because movies don't necessarily have to be scary in order to actually be really good horror films. There's a lot of horror films that don't scare me in the least bit now. But it's just not that scary of a film, and I do appreciate the fact they don't rely on jump scares in this, though, because at least then it gives you a chance to live off the atmosphere of it, and if you are going to get scared, you're going to get scared because it really is just an entirely scary environment, and they help to set up this just like really eerie feeling to be like kind of placed in, and that I do feel succeeds. And it is weird because, again, being this big 2000s movie or 2000s remake, and a lot of them were going on, I guess I would have expected a little bit more in the scares department, and that's okay because it's not that kind of movie. And when they do go extreme, when they do choose to really gross us out or freak us out or be very mean in this, they can be mean in The Hitcher for sure. So, what I can tell you to take from this is that both these films have a reason to exist. It's kind of like the original Fright Night and the Fright Night remake, to where both of them are really good movies. And of course, I think the remake is better. They're both really good. The remake is better. And maybe that's too generous of a comparison. But what I will say is that if you like the original Hitcher, this doesn't do anything to invalidate that. But it's a different story in that kind of universe. Like how I described Black Christmas, to where all three of those movies, like literally nothing to do with each other, but it's the same premise of a group of young women at a college are terrorized by a person or persons or somebody who's targeted their sorority. And again, that's the only similarity. And the similarities with the original Hitcher and this one end at the fact that, unfortunately, a young person or a young couple run across a hitchhiker who is more dangerous than he initially lets on. And in that aspect, I think that this movie works extremely well. And if you are a big fan of 2000s horror films, to where there are less than the case of jump scares and more about building the actual setting itself, then this can be a really, really good movie for you to check out as well too. Honestly, it's kind of interesting because one movie that actually like seems very reminiscent of this one is Shia LaBeouf's Disturbia, which is another horror film that I absolutely love. But that was like a mid-2000s one as well, to where there wasn't much in the way of jump scares or anything like that, but it was mean, it was bloody, it was it had some deaths in there for sure, and that's one I would definitely recommend checking out too if you're looking for the same kind of movie. Now, the Hitcher is able to rent on most streaming platforms, so you definitely want to check it out when you get the chance. Hey everybody, I appreciate you checking out this video, whether it was a review, whether it was a new episode, whether it was an unboxing, an interview, or whatever else. I want to remind you can check out my separate reviews also on my YouTube page, and new full episodes go up every Wednesday night on YouTube at 8:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and on your favorite podcasting platforms at 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like and share. My name is T. We've been talking scary movies. Stay scared.